The signs were set up and perfectly placed by the front door, after I spent the last couple of days making sure every detail was just right. But now came the tough part. I headed up the stairs to the master bedroom, stripped the bed in a hurry, and wrangled the mattress off the queen-sized frame. It was too big to carry outright, so I half lifted, half dragged it down the stairs, through the hallway, out the front door, and onto the lawn, right next to the street. Back inside, I tossed the bed slats and sheets downstairs, followed by a trip outside to add them to the growing pile by the mattress. One more trip upstairs, and I took apart the side rails, carrying them outside in one swift motion. A quick glance at my watch told me it was 4:22. Time was slipping away, and I had to finish this by 5. By 4:35, the bed was reassembled. Next on the list was the kitchen table, light enough for me to handle solo. I turned it sideways to get it through the door and placed it beside the bed in the yard. The last piece was the 6x8 rug from the living room. I rolled it up, carried it outside, and added it to the display on the lawn. With the signs up and everything arranged just right, I checked the time again. 4:55. Only 10 minutes until my wife would pull into the driveway. I stepped into the middle of the street to take it all in, admiring the scene I had created. There it was, the bed we once shared, the kitchen table where we had our meals, and the rug from the living room. 3 places I knew had been used by my wife and her lover repeatedly over the last 6 months. The signs I had so carefully crafted completed the picture. I walked up to each piece of furniture, reading aloud the large signs in front of them. These items are free for the taking. No longer wanted in this house. If you can stand the smell of infidelity and shattered promises, help yourself. The sign by the bed gave the dirty details of my wife's cheating, spelling out how often she'd been sneaking around with her lover for half a year. The sign in front of the kitchen table went even further, describing their activities, usually right before she served me dinner. The one on the rug? It left no doubt that this was their preferred spot for some of their more intimate moments. Each sign had a 17x24-inch photo of the happy couple, my wife and Mark Adams, captured in the act, their faces full of lust. Behind the table, a 5th sign proudly revealed Mark's identity. Her boss, Mark Adams, the charming leader of Mitchell Price and Adams Realty. A married man with 3 kids, blissfully unaware of his wife's secrets, at least for now. By 4:57, the stage was set. She'd be home any minute. I stood there for a second, glancing around at the gathering crowd. Neighbors stopping to gawk, cars slowing down to a crawl. Some folks were already on their phones, probably calling their friends or the cops. I didn't care. I gave them a nod and slipped back inside the house, closing the door behind me. At exactly 5 p.m., her car turned the corner. She slowed down as she saw the commotion outside our house, her eyes locking on the display on the lawn. I could only imagine her reaction as she stared at the furniture and the signs, her eyes surely lingering on those huge photos of her and Mark in their moments of passion. Even through the window, over the crowd of 40, maybe 50 people, I heard her scream, "No. Oh God, no." Her voice was desperate, panicked. She finally tore her eyes away from the spectacle and looked toward the house, spotting me standing by the window. Our eyes met, and for a second, it felt like she was trying to ask me why, as if she didn't know. Her face was pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. It was as if she couldn't believe what was happening, like she was living in some sort of nightmare. I stared at her for a moment, then turned away and pulled the curtain closed. Now seems like a good time to tell you how we got here, how my wife, Emily, and I ended up in this hellish mess. My name's John Smith, by the way. I met Emily back in college, during our junior year. A mutual friend introduced us, and from the moment I laid eyes on her, I was hooked. Emily wasn't what most people would call beautiful, not in the traditional sense, but she had this magnetism about her. At 5 feet 2 inches, with striking blue eyes and shoulder-length blonde hair, her petite, perfectly proportioned figure was all I could think about. From that first meeting, I knew I had to win her over, and I never doubted that I could. We started dating almost immediately, and it didn't take long for us to become inseparable. A month in, we had our first intimate moment together, and man, it was something else. I couldn't get enough of her. Sure, neither of us was new to this kind of thing. But there was something about the way we connected that made every second together feel magical. I thought I was the luckiest guy in the world. Our relationship only deepened as time went on. After we graduated, we got married and moved into a little condo in Van Nuys. She got into real estate, and I landed a job in electronics manufacturing. Together, we built a life that, at the time, seemed perfect. For 13 years, we lived what I thought was an ideal existence. First in that condo and later in a dream home once we could afford it. We had 2 beautiful kids, Shelby, who's 8 now, and Ryan, 6. They were the center of our universe. Our family was everything to me. So how did it all go so wrong? I wish I knew the answer. I wish I'd picked up on the little clues, the subtle signs that something wasn't right. But I didn't. I was blind, living in this fantasy world where I thought everything was perfect. It wasn't until something completely out of the blue happened that I discovered the truth. Our daughter Shelby got sick at school one Thursday, and that was when the whole thing started to unravel. It was just before noon when the school nurse called, letting me know Shelby wasn't feeling well. I was in the middle of a staff meeting at work, so I told the nurse to try reaching Emily. After all, she should have been at her office, or at least reachable on her cell. But after several attempts, there was no answer. So the nurse called me again. Realizing I had to go get my daughter, I apologized to my team and rushed out of the meeting to pick her up. But when I pulled into the garage, I noticed something that made my heart sink. An unfamiliar car was parked in my spot, right next to Emily's. My gut twisted, and a lump formed in my throat. No, I thought. It couldn't be. It just couldn't be. I was in denial, but deep down, I already knew something was terribly wrong. My wife, the woman I had once placed above everyone else in my life, couldn't really be cheating on me, right? But that strange car in the garage, with the door shut tight, told a different story. Something was definitely off, and I needed answers. Fast. I wasn't about to let Shelby, my sweet, innocent daughter, get tangled up in whatever this mess was. So I turned to her and said, "Hey honey, why don't you stay in the car for a second? The exterminator's in the house spraying for bugs, and I don't want you to breathe in the fumes. It'll only take a minute." That was the first lie I'd ever told her. Shelby wasn't too happy about it, grumbling about how tired she was and how she just wanted to go inside. I tried to calm her down, saying I'd check things out real quick and come back to get her. Later, when she asked why I looked so uneasy, I made up another excuse, telling her it was just the smell in the house making me feel sick. I dropped Shelby off at her grandmother's, telling my mom I'd be back in a couple of hours to pick her up. I didn't mention a word about what I suspected or what I had seen. All I asked was for my mom to take care of her while I finished up at work. As much as I wanted to turn right back around, burst into that house and confront my wife and her boss, I knew a simple face-off wouldn't be enough. No, I needed more than just answers. I needed revenge. Real, calculated revenge. As I drove back to my office, ideas started swirling in my head. My workplace, an electronics firm, had multiple divisions, and as a senior engineer in the medical equipment department, I knew there was a commercial security division in the same building. When I got back to the office, I told my secretary to make sure I wasn't disturbed for the rest of the afternoon. Then, I made a call to Dan Taylor, an engineer in the security division and an old friend of mine. Dan was a reliable guy, sharp as a tack. I asked if he could swing by my office since he'd mentioned earlier that he'd be dropping off some blueprints for copying. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. Dan walked in, took one look at me, and said, "John, you look like you've seen a ghost." He wasn't wrong. I motioned for him to close the door and told him I needed his help. Something big had gone down. Without holding back, I told him everything. I laid out how I had walked into the most gut-wrenching scene earlier that day, how I had come home to grab Shelby from school and ended up discovering my wife, Emily, in bed with her boss, right in our house in our bedroom. Dan's face was a mix of shock and disbelief, but I assured him I wasn't exaggerating. It was real. I had seen it with my own eyes. I didn't confront them right then because I didn't want Shelby to know what was happening. Instead, I had quietly left and dropped her off at my mom's. Dan, sympathetic, asked, "So, what's your next move?" I told him I wasn't entirely sure yet, but what I did know was that I needed evidence. Solid proof. I wasn't just going to stand by and let them get away with it. I needed to gather video and audio recordings of their dirty little meetups. That's where Dan came in. At first, Dan wondered if maybe this had been a one-time thing, a mistake that wouldn't happen again. But I quickly shot that down. I knew it wasn't the first time. I had overheard their conversations, half a year's worth of sneaking around while I was at work. My house, of course, was the perfect hideaway during my work hours. They had nowhere else to go. After a few more minutes of conversation, we got down to business. Dan told me about some new wireless mini cameras and microphones his team had been testing. These little gadgets would link up directly with my laptop or home computer, making them perfect for what I needed. He also had a voice-activated recorder I could hide under Emily's car seat. It would only catch her side of the conversation, but it was better than nothing. I thanked him and arranged to pick up the equipment from his office the next day. Driving back home that night was the hardest thing I've ever done. How was I supposed to look at my wife, let alone pretend like everything was fine? When I picked up Shelby from my mom's and got back to the house, there was Emily, busy in the kitchen, making dinner like it was just any other day. The second she saw Shelby, though, she went pale, her eyes wide with panic. I asked her where she had been and why she didn't let me know about Shelby being sick. I said I got a message from the school nurse on the answering machine. Emily stumbled through an excuse, saying she must have accidentally turned off her phone while she was out showing houses and that she had been busy all day. Sure, busy. Busy with her boss, I thought to myself bitterly. But still, Emily hugged Shelby, apologized, and helped her get ready for bed. I can't deny that. For all her faults, Emily did love our kids. That much was clear. But at that moment, I was starting to realize that I was the one standing in the way of her happiness, not the kids. She went back to the kitchen, finishing dinner and preparing some soup for Shelby. Meanwhile, I was feeling sick to my stomach, physically and emotionally. So, I told Emily I'd sleep in the guest room that night, just in case I was coming down with something contagious. She took one look at me and said I looked pale, clammy even. Ironic, really. Here I was, feeling sick to my core because of her betrayal. I didn't even respond, just headed upstairs. I wasn't looking forward to stepping back into our bedroom, but I needed my toothbrush, grooming stuff, and clothes for work the next day. So I forced myself to go in. The window was open, airing out the room, and any lingering smell of their betrayal was gone. The bed was made. Emily must have changed the sheets. It killed me to look at that bed, though. All I could picture was Mark Adams, her boss, in there with her, whispering those sweet lies to her about how she only belonged to him now. Rage bubbled up inside me, but I swallowed it down. I had to stay in control. I had to keep my cool until the time came to unleash the storm on both of them. And believe me, that time was coming. I grabbed what I needed from the master bedroom and retreated to the guest room, closing the door behind me. Stripping down to my underwear, I slid into bed, my body tense and my mind racing. I wanted to break down and cry, but I forced myself to hold it in. I had a mission now, and there was no room for emotions to derail my plans. I lay there for hours in the darkness, unable to sleep. After tucking the kids into bed, Emily slipped into the guest room. I could feel her presence as she pressed her hand against my forehead, checking to see if I was really sick. I kept up the act, pretending to be asleep, and eventually, she left, gently closing the door behind her. Emily was usually the one who took the kids to school, so I made sure to wake up early, shower, and leave the house before she even got up. I'm sure she found it odd, but I didn't care. I could easily blame it on needing to make up for time I lost the day before, when I had felt unwell. Honestly, what she thought didn't matter to me anymore. I just wanted out of this sham of a marriage that I once thought was built on trust and loyalty. How wrong I was. I arrived at work before anyone else, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and started planning. I had a lot to do: cancel our shared credit cards, transfer half of our joint accounts into an account under my own name, update my will, change my life insurance and 401k beneficiaries to Shelby and Ryan. It felt surreal, like it should have been harder to tear apart the last 13 years of my life. But in a way, it was almost too easy, and I knew the real challenge would come later. I needed to find a good divorce attorney too, someone who would protect me from whatever Emily might try to pull. In our no-fault state, Her affair wouldn't do much to change the financial outcome, but it could help me when it came to custody of our kids. As much as Emily had shown me just how little I meant to her, she was still a decent mother, and I didn't want to rip the kids away from her. I just wanted joint custody, enough to make sure I stayed in their lives. I pushed thoughts of our once passionate love life out of my head, along with the humiliation of overhearing her say how much better her boss was than me. If I let myself dwell on that now, I'd crumble. That breakdown would come later, and when it did, it would be devastating. But not now. Not yet. Once I had everything written out, I called Dan. He told me everything would be ready by noon and even offered to help install the equipment. I tried focusing on my work to pass the time, but it wasn't easy, especially when Emily's name popped up on my phone screen. Her voice, once comforting, only made my blood boil. She asked how I was feeling, saying she hadn't had a chance to check on me before I left that morning. I kept my answers vague, telling her I needed some time to clear my head. She suggested doing something nice that evening to help me feel better, but the thought of spending time with her made my stomach turn. Still, I played along, saying we'd see. She seemed to pick up on my lack of interest and asked if everything was okay between us. I brushed it off, telling her I was just distracted with work. We agreed to meet at home by 6 p.m., and she made sure to mention she'd be at the office all day if I needed anything. Yeah, sure. I bet she'd be at the office all day. All right, probably working with her boss. At noon, I met Dan at the loading dock. We loaded up his van with all the gear, and with his help, we had everything set up and running by 3:30. Cameras and microphones were installed in the living room, kitchen, guest bedroom, and of course, the master bedroom. I made sure to cover every angle in there. 4 cameras total. We even put one in the master bathroom, just in case they decided to take their little escapades into the shower. The system was motion activated, with the cameras automatically triggering the microphones. It was perfect. I was ready. That night was brutal. After dinner, once the kids were asleep, I followed Emily up to our bedroom, but I couldn't bear to look at her. I turned my back and pretended to fall asleep. Sensing the shift in our usual routine, Emily asked if everything was okay. I gave her some half-truths about feeling insecure, saying I wasn't sure if I was enough for her. She acted all shocked, telling me I was more than enough and that she couldn't imagine life without me. She even went so far as to say I was her perfect lover. Yeah, right. As much as her words were meant to comfort me, they only felt like more lies. I stayed distant, brushed off her concern, and mumbled something about being tired. Soon after, she started quietly crying. I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. Instead, I wondered if she was crying out of guilt or because she felt like I was mistreating her. Before dawn, I got up and took the chance to slip the voice recorder under the seat of her car. Then I reviewed the footage and audio from the night before. Everything came through clearly. The cameras had even captured her every move in the dim light of our bedroom. When Emily finally got up, she was cold toward me, mentioning how hurtful my words had been the night before. But after a quick kiss on the cheek, her mood shifted, as if she was already looking forward to something later in the day. I figured it had something to do with her afternoon plans with Mark. I poured her a cup of coffee and told her I'd be locked in my office all day, barely able to contain the contempt I felt. Emily mentioned she had a full afternoon of showing homes and felt confident she'd close a big sale. Still, she assured me she'd pick up Shelby and Ryan after school. With a quick peck on her cheek, I made my way to the garage. As I reached for the door, Emily called out, reminding me that I'd forgotten to say, "I love you." She stressed how much it meant to hear those words from me every morning. I muttered an apology, explaining that I just had a lot on my mind, but she wasn't satisfied. She insisted it was important, and I promised not to forget next time. Yeah, sure. I'll say those words again when I find someone I can actually trust, if I ever find someone like that again. Her mention of showing homes all afternoon only solidified what I already knew. She'd be with her true love, Mark. And honestly, I hope she was. I was done playing these games, and I just wanted this entire ordeal over with. I spent the morning at the office, trying to focus on work, but I kept checking the clock, waiting for the right moment to put my plan in motion. Finally, at noon, I told my secretary I'd be out for a few hours. I borrowed a company van and parked across the street from my house, lying in wait. It wasn't until around 1 p.m. that I saw Emily's car pull up. She opened the garage door and parked in her usual spot, heading inside without bothering to close the garage. That was my first clue she wasn't done for the day. She was either heading out again or expecting someone. 10 minutes later, my suspicions were confirmed. The same car from that fateful day, the day I caught them, pulled into the garage, sliding right into my spot. Just like Mark had slid into my place in Emily's life. He stepped out of the car, and the garage door closed behind him. I had to hand it to them. They were brazen, meeting in my home, in my bed. They clearly thought they wouldn't get caught, or maybe they just didn't care. Either way, they were wrong. They were caught, and soon they'd both feel the consequences. With the final proof of my wife's betrayal secured, I finally let the tears come. For 13 years, I'd believed Emily would never cheat on me, just as I had never strayed from her. But with the tears came doubts. Was Mark better in bed? Was he more attractive? Maybe. But neither of us were anything special, so why risk it all? I wanted so badly to barge in and confront them both. But why? What good would it do? I'd already caught them once. Would another confrontation make me feel any better? Maybe, but I'd likely end up in jail for whatever came next. At this point, neither of them were worth that. My only concern now was how all this would affect our kids, and his, for that matter. By 2:30, they had finished. The garage door opened, and Mark left, with Emily following 15 minutes later. I knew she'd be back with the kids by 3:30, so I hurried into the garage, parked the van, and made my way into my office. I didn't need to review the footage in detail. I just wanted to make sure everything had been recorded properly. After a few minutes of watching, I'd seen enough. It wasn't a carbon copy of what I'd caught before, but it was explicit and more than enough proof. They started in the kitchen, on the table where I'd eaten countless meals. I watched as they joked about how many times they had wondered if I ever realized I was eating where they'd been intimate so often. Then they moved to our bedroom, though Mark suggested using our daughter's room for a change of scenery. Thankfully, Emily refused, saying the kids' rooms were off limits. At least she had some boundaries, just none when it came to me. They continued their activities in the bedroom, though I noticed neither of them exchanged any words of love. Still, Emily didn't miss a beat in praising Mark as the best lover she'd ever had. And then, for some reason, they moved to the living room rug by the fireplace for another round. I couldn't make sense of it. By the time they were done, Emily didn't even bother changing the sheets. She probably planned to do it after she picked up the kids. I had to give it to her. She was thorough in covering her tracks. She'd air out the room and make sure no evidence was left by the time I usually got home around 6. I'd seen enough. The footage was safely stored on my hard drive, and I didn't care to check the mess left behind in our bed. My heart was hardened against Emily, but even then, I felt physically ill. That sickness quickly turned into pure rage and hatred. I may have even smiled, knowing the hell I was about to bring down on both their heads. Back at work, I filled Dan in on everything. He couldn't believe it either. How could a woman who once seemed so loving, so devoted, turn around and do something like this? Not only had she broken the vows we made on our wedding day, but she had gone out of her way to humiliate me to her lover, constantly assuring Mark that he was superior to me in every way. Those thoughts sank me deeper into a dark place, a pit of pain and despair that I knew I had to climb out of if I was going to see this through. I had to destroy them both, and I would. Dan suggested I get in touch with the law firm our company used for recommendations on a good divorce lawyer. I needed someone who could protect me and my rights as a husband and father. After calling them, I got the names of 3 divorce attorneys known for standing up for men in these situations. The first one was about to retire and wasn't taking new clients, but the second one agreed to meet me the following afternoon at 3 p.m. With that lined up, I turned my attention to canceling credit cards, changing beneficiaries, and transferring funds the next morning. Everything was falling into place. Soon, I'd be free of Emily and her lies. But for now, I had to keep playing my role. When I walked through the door that evening, Emily was in the kitchen, making dinner. The kids were tucked away in their rooms, busy with homework. She had on this yellow sundress, looking as radiant as ever, and for a brief moment, I felt my heart begin to break all over again. She was smiling, probably riding the high from her little afternoon rendezvous. It didn't take much to see that familiar post-affair glow. She greeted me cheerfully, asking how my day had been, mentioning she had made a sale. I answered with just enough interest to keep the charade going, knowing all too well the real reason for her happiness. I casually asked if anything else interesting had happened, or if she'd met anyone notable. She denied it, saying she had been entirely focused on work, trying to make it home to her family. Family, huh? The word felt like a slap in the face. I headed upstairs to change clothes, still feeling the weight of her lies pressing down on me. The sheets in the bedroom had been changed, the air in the room fresh. She'd made sure to cover her tracks. When I got back downstairs, I asked about the wet floor in the shower, casually mentioning it like I had noticed it on my way up. "Did you take a shower this afternoon?" I asked. Her eyes flickered with surprise before she caught herself. She denied it, making up some excuse about a clogged drain. I pushed a little, hinting that maybe someone had sneaked into the house for a quick shower after a rendezvous. She laughed it off, trying to brush it away with some awkward humor, but I could see the unease creeping in. Dinner was quiet after that. I decided to switch seats with her at the table, just to mess with her a little. She asked why the sudden change, and I told her I wanted a different view. She didn't eat much after that, just pushed the food around her plate, probably wondering what I was up to. The kids, thankfully, kept the conversation going, talking about their day at school, while Emily and I mostly stayed silent. Once dinner was over and we'd finished cleaning up, I slipped away to my office, where the real work began. I spent the next hour reviewing the footage from earlier in the day. It was all there, everything I needed. I selected the stills I wanted and saved them to a photo file, ready for printing. Then, I started crafting the text for the signs I planned to display. The wheels were in motion. All that was left now was to finalize things with my lawyer, get my finances squared away, and wait for Emily and her boss to slip up one last time. By the time I went to bed that night, Emily was already asleep, or pretending to be. I had a strong feeling my little actions at dinner had left her with something to think about, not that it mattered. There was nothing she could say or do to change the inevitable. Divorce was happening. Her betrayal was unforgivable, and I was done. But there was a small satisfaction in knowing I had finally made her uneasy. She'd mentioned making another sale on Thursday, and I took that as a cue that she'd be meeting Mark again. Thursday would be the day I brought them both down for good. The next morning, I woke early again, showered, and left the house before Emily even stirred. I had a lot to get done and wanted to make sure I had all the time I needed. My meeting with the lawyer wasn't until 3 p.m., so I had the whole morning to handle the financial side of things. First stop was HR, where I changed the beneficiaries on my life insurance and 401k, removing Emily and replacing her with Shelby and Ryan. The HR rep gave me a strange look, but I didn't owe anyone an explanation. Next, I canceled all our joint credit cards and ordered new ones in my name alone. From there, I went to the bank, transferring half of the money from our joint checking and savings into a new account under my name. I knew I needed to deal with the house eventually, but I figured the courts would likely let Emily stay there with the kids, at least for now. I'd wait to hear what the lawyer had to say before making any big decisions about the house. At 3 p.m., I met with the lawyer. He seemed competent enough, though he warned me that since we lived in a no-fault state, Emily would likely get custody of the kids, the house, and half of everything else, even with all the evidence of her infidelity. I wasn't too concerned. I told him how I wanted the divorce petition drafted, and when he hesitated, expressing doubt about my chances of getting everything I wanted, I reassured him. I had my own plan to get Emily to agree to my terms, one way or another. He wasn't thrilled, but he agreed to have everything ready for her to be served by Friday morning. I also had him prepare documents to sue her boss and his company for knowingly wrecking my marriage. Those papers would be ready by Friday, too. Everything was coming together. That evening, when I got home, I kept things cool and distant. I was beyond done with the charade and just wanted this nightmare to be over so I could move on. Dinner was quiet, the conversation strained. Afterward, I retreated to my study, printed out the incriminating photos, and finished up the signs I planned to use for my final act of revenge. I even found time to write a letter to Mark Adams's wife, including prints of the photos I intended to use on the signs. I let her know I had plenty more video evidence if she wanted it for her divorce, just like I was using it for mine. Around 11 p.m., I slipped into our bedroom. Emily was asleep, or at least pretending again. I quietly grabbed the voice recorder I had hidden in her car, rewound it, and listened. Sure enough, I overheard her side of a conversation. It was Mark. I didn't need to hear his voice to know it. This would all be over soon, and I couldn't wait for the day I'd be free from both of them and their lies. The voice on the other end of the call sounded content, grateful for their stolen time together that afternoon. She told Mark how much she missed him every time they were apart, and they started planning a whole week together, making up a lie about some real estate convention they needed to attend. She talked about how she had to give me just enough attention to keep me satisfied, but admitted she really wanted to be with Mark full-time. Then, they confirmed their next meetup for Thursday afternoon before ending the call. Oddly enough, her words didn't sting as much as they once had. Maybe, after all this, there was still hope for me. Hope that I could eventually heal. Little did she know, though, that she was about to be exclusively his forever, and sooner than she thought. Knowing I was just one day away from unraveling their entire comfortable lives gave me a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt before. Revenge, I realized, was a powerful motivator. I swapped out the tape with a fresh one and slipped the recorder back under her car seat, hoping it would catch every bit of her anguish when her world came crashing down the next day. I hardly slept that night, not because I was heartbroken. No, I'd passed that point long ago. What kept me up was the anticipation, the thrill of seeing everything I had planned finally come to fruition. For the last time, I rose from the bed we had once shared. Emily was still sleeping, blissfully unaware of the storm heading her way. I stood there for a moment, just watching her. She had once been the love of my life, the mother of my children, the woman I thought I'd grow old with. But those days were gone. My heart felt heavy as I realized that I'd never hold her again, never share those intimate moments, never plan a future with her. That future was gone, dead. As I turned away and left the room, I wondered if she had any idea of the price she was about to pay for her betrayal. She probably didn't, but she'd soon find out. After showering, I left the house, grabbed breakfast at a nearby diner, and stopped by the office to let my secretary know I wouldn't be in for the rest of the day. I called Dan next, briefing him on what was about to go down. He wished me luck, told me to be careful, and asked me to keep him updated. From there, I made a quick stop at my lawyer's office to make sure everything was in place to serve both Emily and Mark Adams the next day. I called Emily afterward to arrange picking up the kids from school. My mother had offered to take them for the long weekend since they didn't have school on Friday, so I planned to swing by the house around 3:45, pack some clothes, and take the kids straight to her. Emily seemed thrilled at the idea, even teasing that we could spend Saturday in bed together in her usual seductive tone. I played along, agreeing casually, but inside, I was sick of the lies. I couldn't stand it any longer. I took my time heading home, not in any rush. By 12:30, I was parked around the corner, lying in wait. My car was mostly hidden, but I had a clear view of the driveway. I didn't need to see the garage door. I knew their routine like clockwork. Emily was nothing if not predictable. At 12:50, her car rolled into the driveway, and, as expected, 5 minutes later, Mark's car followed. The trap was set, and I waited patiently as they went inside to carry on their affair in my home, in my bed. The strange part? I didn't feel the agony I thought I would. The thought of Emily and Mark together didn't even hurt anymore. It was like watching a bad, low-budget adult film play out in my head. Cheap, tasteless, and with a predictable ending. Around 10 minutes before 3, Mark's car backed out of the driveway, and a few minutes later, Emily left too. She was putting on fresh lipstick as she drove off, as if nothing had happened. Once they were gone, I pulled into the garage and closed the door behind me. I didn't have much time, so I went straight to my office and reviewed the footage from their little rendezvous. Everything was captured. Every kiss, every word, every insult about how Mark was so much better than me in bed. But none of it stung anymore. It was just more evidence. I stored the footage securely on my hard drive and then carried the signs I'd prepared upstairs, positioning them by the front door, ready for the next day. After packing some essentials for Shelby and Ryan, I sat for a moment. The only real sadness I felt was for my kids. They didn't deserve this. None of it was their fault. The pain of our family falling apart lay squarely on Emily's shoulders. She was the one who had chosen this path. She was the one who had ripped us apart. At 3:15, I picked the kids up from school. They were thrilled when I told them they'd be spending the weekend at Grandma's, knowing she'd spoil them rotten. By 4 o'clock, I had dropped them off, and I headed back home, ready to set everything in motion. And that brings us back to where it all began. The bed, the table, the rug, all neatly displayed on the lawn, adorned with signs and watched by a growing crowd of neighbors, as I waited for Emily to come face to face with the ugly truth. I held all the cards now, and soon, she'd know it too. That evening, I didn't hear from Emily right away. There was one late-night call from her cell, but when I picked up, all I heard was silence on the other end. Maybe she had seen what I had done and didn't know how to respond. An hour later, the police showed up at my door. The officers were polite but firm when they arrived at my door. They understood my situation but insisted I take down the signs and photos. They warned me about disturbing the peace and public indecency charges if I didn't comply. I agreed. I had made my point. Emily had seen everything, and from the look on her face, I knew her life had just begun its descent into chaos. That night, I numbed myself with a hefty amount of Maker's Mark, eventually slipping into a drunken haze. When Friday morning arrived, it greeted me with a brutal hangover, but despite the pounding headache, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. Sure, I was heartbroken and alone, but I had held back my rage long enough to get my revenge. That, at least, gave me some comfort. Around noon, I glanced out the window to see that the rug, kitchen table, and bed were gone. Only the mattress and those stained sheets remained. I figured I'd get rid of them later. The morning was uneventful, but by mid-afternoon, the chaos began to unfold. By 3 p.m., I knew Mark's wife had likely received the letter and photos I sent her, and my lawyer informed me that both Emily and Mark had been served at their workplaces. He told me Emily had broken down in tears upon being served, while Mark brushed her off and started making threats against me. His partners had quickly retreated into their office, staying behind closed doors for about 15 minutes. When they emerged, they handed Emily her final paycheck and informed Mark that his partnership with the firm was over. When he refused to sell his shares, they invoked a morality clause in the corporate bylaws, citing his affair with a subordinate as grounds for terminating him. At the same time, the receptionist relayed that Mark's wife was on the phone, demanding to speak with him. She had received my letter and photos and was letting him know he was not welcome back home and that she planned to file for divorce the very next day. Later, I heard from a co-worker's husband that, after Mark was escorted out of the building, everyone turned their backs on Emily. She stayed on the floor, crying for about 30 minutes before pulling herself together enough to leave. No one knew where she went. The following day, Emily finally called me. Her voice was shaky and full of despair as she asked about the kids, wanting to know if they were aware of what had happened. I assured her they were safe at my mother's and that I wouldn't tell them any details. She thanked me for that and asked if she could come by to pick up some of her things. I agreed, telling her I'd be out for a few hours so she could gather her belongings in peace. She asked if we could talk, but I refused, which sent her into more tears. She begged for my understanding, claiming she never meant to hurt me. I couldn't help but laugh. I asked how she could say that when she had spent months telling Mark she loved him, praising him, and comparing him to me. I reminded her that I had recordings of her saying those things, but she denied it, insisting she hadn't meant any of it. I told her the words were recorded, so it didn't matter what she said now. She tried to explain, saying she had always loved only me and didn't know why she'd said those things to Mark. She claimed she'd done it to boost his ego because he had complained about his wife. I wasn't buying it. I pressed her, reminding her how she had trashed me to Mark while sleeping with him. She swore she never meant to hurt me and that it had all felt dirty with Mark, something she wanted to keep separate from what we had. She called our relationship loving and clean. I stared at the phone in disbelief. "You're sick," I told her, shaking my head at my own foolishness for not seeing this sooner. Emily kept pleading for a chance to make things right, saying she still loved me and belonged with me. She begged for forgiveness, offering to come over immediately, but I cut her off. I told her I no longer loved her, that she was the one who had left me. I reminded her of the past 6 months, of how her actions had shown she didn't love me. I made it clear I was disgusted by her and couldn't wait for her to be out of my life for good. I told her the only reason I'd deal with her anymore was because of our children, whom she had hurt just as much as me. I assured her I'd never spare her from the consequences of what she had done. She grew defensive, asking why I had to involve Mark's wife. I snapped back that what she and Mark had done was unfair to both our families, and that his wife deserved to know the truth. Emily said she didn't want a divorce, that she wanted to fight for our marriage. I told her there was nothing left to fight for. I'd rather die than stay married to her. She was delusional if she thought anything could be salvaged. She then switched tactics, saying that if I agreed to joint custody, I could stay in the house and get half of everything. But she also hinted that if I didn't agree to her terms, she might share the videos of her affair to embarrass me. I wasn't convinced she'd actually do it, but she insisted that, out of spite, she would. Even then, I told her no. I said she was the one who should sign the papers, and I hung up on her. Emily must have gotten the message because she signed the divorce papers, and in 6 months, it was finalized. She stayed in the house with Shelby and Ryan, while I moved into a nearby condo. We kept things civil for the sake of the kids, but they still felt the effects of the breakup. Shelby mentioned that their mom admitted she had made a mistake and knew our marriage couldn't survive it. I reassured the kids that, no matter what, we'd always be there for them. I don't know what Emily told her family, but they still talk to me, which makes me think she didn't try to blame everything on me. My mother always said that once this happened, there'd be no going back for either of us. I retrieved the voice recorder from Emily's car one last time. It captured a telling conversation. Emily had called Mark, thanking him for their time together and expressing her fear that I might be suspicious. She suggested they take a break from the affair. When she got home and saw the signs and photos, she had called Mark in a panic, sobbing, realizing the full weight of what had happened. It's been over a year now. I'm slowly piecing my life back together, though I'm still not ready to date. I don't think I could go through something like this again, and the idea of trusting someone feels impossible right now. Shelby told me her mom went on one date but came home in tears, and as far as I know, she hasn't dated since. Emily works as a receptionist in a retirement village, having put her real estate career on hold. I don't know if she's still in contact with Mark, but frankly, I couldn't care less. Mark and his wife divorced, and he's struggled to find work since then. Apparently, people don't want to hire a guy who wrecked his own marriage by sleeping with a colleague's wife. Businesses seem to be wary of men like that. I blurred Emily's face in the videos, but I kept all the audio, just in case. I've heard Mark's ex-wife is dating a police officer now, and things are getting serious. Good for her. As for Mark's former company, they offered me a generous settlement to avoid a lawsuit. I took the money and closed that chapter of my life. Now, my focus is solely on my kids and their future. Maybe, someday, I'll start thinking about my own future too.